Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. This is Charles Douglas here at the Access Humboldt Media Center in Eureka, bringing you a whole new season of Sentinel interviews. It's 2012, it's definitely election time, and we have an open seat on the North Coast for the first time in 14 years, with a dozen or so candidates running for U.S. Congress. We speak with one of them, Norman Solomon, who made an appearance at the Labor Temple in Eureka last week. Remember, you can catch all the episodes of Sentinel interviews with all the candidates running for local, state, and federal office right here on Access Humboldt Channel 12 every Thursday at 7 o'clock, Sunday at 3:30, and Wednesday at 5:30. You can also see it on demand on YouTube. That's youtube.com/Humboldt Sentinel.
Well, thank you for joining us. And this is an auspicious evening, I think, because the historic day has come where the Ninth Circuit of the Federal Court has ruled that Prop 8 is unconstitutional, that it denies certain people, that is gays and lesbians, from having rights that are afforded to others. And of course this will be appealed, but I think this is definitely a watershed positive day that we can celebrate. And it got me to thinking about, since we're going to talk about labor and the economy and so forth, how progress is not always straight line. And you think about women's rights, gay rights, the rights of workers to organize, and we like to think that every year it's getting better than the year before, and there's this arc of progress, and certainly that's long-term what we aspire to and what we can say with some justification has been the history, decade after decade. Civil liberties, civil rights have been expanded in this country. There's that famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr. where he talks about how the arc of justice bends, arc of history and time bends towards justice, and we want that to be reality, and overall it is. But I think that the struggle for gay rights is a reminder with its progress, but with setbacks too, in terms of ballot measures and some court rulings. When you think about how there's been so much progress in the formation, the growth of unions, the right to organize, and yet in this second decade already of the 21st century, the setbacks, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, against public employees, just very recently, the so-called right to work that's been imposed in Indiana, where now unions are put behind the 8 ball for contributions, union contributions from fellow employees who benefit from the fact that they're in a unionized workplace, but that long-term effort by economic forces hostile to union rights, that effort is bearing some fruit to pry apart workers, whether they're members of unions or not. They're all benefiting from a unionized workplace. And yet the so-called right to work, and this is part of the buzzword problem, the so-called right to work state momentum is moving, I think, from the standpoint of workers and unions in the wrong direction. So I bring that up because these rights and the economic well-being of working people, and as I say, want to be working people who are unable to find jobs, those aspirations are continually under pressure. And to me it means that we have this need for the cliche, but it's true, is eternal vigilance. And I think that's where we are now. When we look at the situation for people who are trying to earn a living, secure retirement benefits that they can depend on. And when you think about how this is now an area of contention, that people who work for a state, a city, a county, who have been promised retirement benefits, and then maybe they've been working there 5, 10, 15, 20 years at a government agency, and the political arena is under such pressure that it has become an open question as to whether what people were promised will actually be fulfilled. It's as though working people don't have the assurance that the contract, the social contract that they're party to, will actually be fulfilled. And so when I think about what's going on in Humboldt County in terms of the economy, that is a very pressing context for us. The downward pressure on wages, the pressure to reduce people's benefits, people's pensions. And meanwhile, we have now chronic unemployment. And our campaign, and we have details at solomonforcongress.com, really is an advocacy for a Green New Deal, a process that does not leave people's futures to the benefit of Wall Street or the changes in the desires of large corporate managers to fire and hire at will. So I think a lot of the question is, where's the security? Where's the security for people who live on fixed incomes, Social Security, for instance? Where's the security of people who are employed or perhaps underemployed? Where's the security of children who have to worry about, or their parents have to worry about, whether there's going to be school buses or not to take them to public school? And this is an index of where we are now, I think, in terms of the challenge to reassert the rights of working people and others who are questioning, quite rightly, their own security. And so our campaign is really an effort to reassert workers' rights and also assert that the social compact has to be protected rather than have the social safety net ripped open. I say that I'm an unreconstructed New Dealer in the sense that I don't believe in trickle-down economics. I don't believe in trickle-down job creation. We've seen that it doesn't work. We know the economy's in the ditch. We know that it's been a chronic condition now for several years. Many communities, it didn't start in 2008. It just the manipulations by the big banks and large Wall Street concerns and the trading of derivatives to the points of trillions of dollars back and forth, that brought it to a crisis point in 2008. But there are many communities who've really been suffering from depression or near depression or chronic recession for a long time before that. And one of the elements that I think really has to be confronted, and that is certainly a huge problem in Humboldt County, is the chronic unemployment where you have a record number of people who've been employed for short times and then unemployed, often for long times, often for more than 52 weeks. And so what does it do to a community when unemployment stretches from weeks to months into years? And one of my concerns and why I think that this district needs to have authentic advocacy in Washington, so to speak, occupying our seat in Congress with advocating for the 99%, is that we know that the budgets of counties, cities, and the state continue to go downward. That as bad as the budget is one year, it is usually worse the next year. And this has been the pattern year after year. So then the question is, well, what's the plausible solution here? We hear officials, I think, with great sincerity saying, well, we're going to create jobs in our city, in our county. And the question, though, is how? Where's the revenue? When the budgets are worse, as bad as it is, then the next fiscal year it's even worse. And I think we have to be realistic. To me, it's not about ideology. I mean, when I looked at the history of the New Deal, there were many people who, from an ideological standpoint, said, I don't like this plan for New Deal. It's not my idea of what this country is. This country is, as I think it was Coolidge said, the business of this country is business. We don't want government to play such a role. And a lot of those folks became devotees of FDR and the New Deal because they saw it worked. And I think that's really the question, not some abstract ideology. The question is, what's going to pull the economy out of the ditch? What's going to provide employment security, good jobs that are long-lasting, retirement security? That's what people understandably want to know. And whether your ideology is left, right, or center, or sounds good in theory, is really secondary and often beside the point. The question is, what's going to work plausibly? And right now, I think we've seen a textbook, storybook case of what isn't working. When I think from an ideological and power standpoint, because there's so much big money that is calling the tune in Washington from Wall Street. I like to say, unfortunately, Wall Street is dominating Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. That intersection of Wall Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, and often manifested in Congress, is such that other solutions are just kept off the table. And the solutions that are, the solutions, I put in quote, that are put forward are often ruinous. The so-called austerity programs, the cutbacks. You know, during the New Deal, when millions of jobs were added, then the deficit hawks of the day began to circle in 1935 and 1936, and they said, oh no, but the budget's not balanced. Yes, people are back to work, but there's too big of a deficit. And so they curtailed and slashed public investment, and history shows what happened in 1936 and 1937. Essentially, the country went into a double-dip depression. And I think that we benefited tremendously from the stimulus package of 2009. Jobs were created, you know, it wasn't big enough, as you say. It was a start, and rather than redouble it, what happened is the deficit hawks circled and squawked and complained, and we didn't get more stimulus. And the initial effect of the stimulus, as you say, inadequate, but did some good, that fell away. And economists who were saying this is the right direction, but not enough funding, we need $2 or $3 trillion of stimulus, they were sort of blown off. You know, you had Paul Krugman at the New York Times, you had Robert Reich, the former labor secretary, you had economists like Dean Baker, Mark Weisbrot, Joseph Stiglitz. They were saying, you know, you need, it's basic Keynesian economics, nothing fancy. You need to create jobs, you need to create revenue. People get back to work, they'll spend money. When they spend money, there's more tax revenue, and the spiral moves upward. But instead of that, we had this curtailing of the potential of a stimulus process. And now I think, arguably, we're suffering from some semblance of a double-dip recession, certainly in many communities. And you can sort of see it in the streets almost. I think one reality is that when you talk about, and we should be talking about, I think, the need for massive public investment, that, as a practical matter, can't come from cash-strapped business-deprived, you might say, local communities. I mean, there are businesses, but they're not flourishing, many of them. So the problem of counties and cities and the state always needing to balance its budget has really foreclosed a capacity to really do a lot of public investment. That's where the federal government comes in. I think the federal government is uniquely positioned to create massive public investment. And what would that mean? I mean, it would mean infrastructure, it would mean jobs, it would be roads, bridges, bike trails. You could have like the old CCC or WPA of the New Deal. Stay away from the two extremes that I think we've sort of been buffeted at both extreme directions. One is, it's the right-wing Republican response. If your county, if your city, if your state is in economic crisis, good luck, we wish you well, but it's not our problem, so just you go deal with it. Well, I think that's wrong. There are kids, there are elderly, there are vulnerable who are suffering as a result of those kind of priorities. And to just say, well, you're an American and we are the US government, but we have no responsibility for you. If you twist in the wind, that's your problem. I'm sorry to hear it, but that's tough. That is wrong. If you go to the other extreme, you have a federal government that says, okay, we'll give you some money, but we're going to micromanage, and we're going to take away your responsibilities and your opportunities and your autonomy in your community, and after all, you know your community best, but we're going to tell you that we know best. That obviously that's not working, and it causes a lot of understandable resentment. And this is the key point too, making our own decisions at the local level, because I really don't want federal officials in Washington deciding exactly whether you're going to have the rail line here, if you're going to bring the barge in here, exactly what you're going to do on the waterfront. We have environmental standards, we have labor standards. Yes, those need to be adhered to, but in terms of making those long-term assessments for how you're going to build infrastructure, how you're going to help entrepreneurs, how you're going to create and sustain jobs, that needs to be decided at the local level. So I think that's the best relationship between federal spending and local autonomy. In early fall of 2008, there was a crucial vote in the Congress we had Democrats and Republicans who voted for a huge bailout of the Wall Street banks. And I, among all the candidates in this race, am the only person who at the time, while it was being debated, spoke out against and wrote against the big Wall Street bank bailouts. I'm very proud of that because at the time, you may remember, the whole mood was, and Naomi Klein has written about this phenomenon in her book, The Shock Doctrine, that just, oh, when there's a crisis, the sky is falling and those huge forces that stand to gain enormous profits from certain kinds of decisions create a stampede and really exploit the crisis for their own benefit. And unfortunately, Wall Street and the big banks did that with the big crisis in early autumn of 2008. And the pressure was very much to approve the bank bailout. And that is in fact what happened. You may remember the last Monday in September 2008, the House of Representatives, with some very liberal Democrats and some Republicans, got a majority to vote against the Wall Street bank bailout. And there was a huge uproar and the media went nuts and the pressure was there. And 96 hours later, they flipped and reversed themselves. Well, this was from a Monday to a Friday, but on Wednesday, I had an article come out in the Marin Daily paper, and it went a lot of places online from there, where I raised the question. I quoted Dean Baker from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a very great economist. He said there's no reason to believe that a huge Wall Street bank bailout will increase liquidity, help homeowners to keep their homes, help small business owners to get loans. And unfortunately, he and I were correct. Yes, the Wall Street banks got bailed out. No, they didn't increase liquidity. No, small businesses and homeowners did not get help. As a matter of fact, more and more of them fell underwater, and tragically, 1 million in the last year losing their homes, going back to the banks. And the net result was that banks, rather than, although they received huge government assistance, rather than helping small business and homeowners, the banks used the tremendous amount of cash to buy other banks. And so that consolidation of banking power was a result of action by Congress. And I think that we need to be willing and able to say to Wall Street, no, we don't accept this too big to fail paradigm, that homeowners should be able to keep their homes if they have bought their homes in good faith, and overwhelmingly that's what homeowners have done. I'm talking about people, I'm not talking about speculators, I'm talking about people who live in their own homes. Right. And small businesses that need liquidity have to be able to have some credit to expand or weather some rough patches. That those people are our priorities, not the Goldman Sachs and the other huge Wall Street banks and investment firms and financial services and so forth, industries. So I think that's a crucial fork in the road, and that's where I don't really buy a lot of the left-right paradigm. I think it's very narrow, I think it's confining, where to a large extent the question is, are you with helping people to withstand the pressures of economic inequity, or are you simply going to rubber stamp what Wall Street wants? And that's why I think the Occupy movement is so important, because it's a way in which people are saying, and I don't know if the camera will pick this up, but this is 99%, this little button, that literally there is a 99% that's suffering from the voracious profit-taking and some might say exploitation of the 1%. And I think Paul Krugman in the New York Times has said 1%, it's actually maybe 1/2 of 1%. You know, these are the elites getting richer and richer, while there's so much misery at the grassroots, not only people who qualify legally as low income or poor, but the new term is near poor. And you can go through one community after another, and near poor is really what is an accurate description. You know, people's financial assets are tumbling, they're in debt, often their homes are underwater, often they're renting. The college debt for students is enormous. Retirement security is increasingly sparse. So I think we need a whole different view of the social compact to say that we are no longer going to leave it to a predatory role of the big banks in Wall Street. And I don't think it's ideological, I think it's practical. When you go through one community after another in Humboldt County and elsewhere, and you see children who are sometimes malnourished, there are a lot of kids who have not seen a dentist for years and years and years, sometimes never, and they're 8 or 10 years old. You have housing that's inadequate. You've got veterans and others who are homeless. You have elderly people who literally have to choose between paying the rent or getting the medication or buying food. And that's totally wrong. It's not necessary by any economic means. It's a result of unequal distribution of wealth and power to such an extreme that we, I think, have a choice now. Are we going to simply try to tweak the system a little bit through the old boys network or old girls network, if you will, of political power? Or are we going to be taking a fresh look and making some new decisions about our priorities? And I think I want to just close before I ask for more questions on that note. When I went to Afghanistan 2.5 years ago, I went with a former US Marine, Rick Reyes, and he had last been in Afghanistan the end of 2001. He had an M16 in his hands. He has come to reevaluate the wisdom of a war that's now in its 11th year in Afghanistan. And when we got there, we saw US soldiers in the streets of Kabul. Each one of them cost $1 million a year to keep there. And the question then, I think, arises, is that the best way to spend $1 million? And if we were to bring even a couple of those soldiers home ahead of schedule, there's still 70,000 or so there, $70 billion a year being the cost to keep them there. What about, well, let me ask you, let's say we could get a rebate check. We bring home 2 more of those folks? $2 million. What do you think $2 million? What could, yeah, in Eureka, what could $2 million do? That's where these priorities questions go from the abstract and policy walk to the very human realities of how many lunches could you buy for kids? How many dentist visits? How much housing could you provide for veterans who are sometimes literally sleeping under bridges? I mean, this is the reality of where we are right now. Part of what really seems to have evolved in the last few years is a reframing of what people have a right to expect. When I was growing up, I'm 60 years old now, and when I was growing up, and all through my 20s and 30s and 40s, it seemed that generally it was understood. If you work for a living, you have a pension plan, the benefits are defined, and you have something you can count on. And between that and Social Security, you could have a reasonable expectation of some real retirement security. There's been that gradual shift to the 401ks and so forth that messages to people, oh, you don't have a right to expect anything in particular. It's a crapshoot. Welcome to the casino. The house rules. You've walked through the door whether you want to or not, and you will take your winnings or your losings and don't complain about it. And I think a lot of this battle over public employees' rights is a precursor, unfortunately, as we're seeing in Indiana now, for a more general assault on the rights of people to organize, and then also, I think underneath that, an assault on people's expectations. And that should just be unacceptable. I mean, I think what people have a right to expect should be defined from the grassroots up, not from the top down. And right now, you know, in times of protracted economic distress, that's, I think, where political organizing comes into play, because historically that's been where we're able to change the rules for the better. Where the House doesn't rule, or, you know, the way to put it, they don't have a thumb on the scales and the big money interests don't get to dominate. And in the 1930s, that battle over definition was very important. Do you have a right to Social Security? Do you have a right to unemployment compensation? That was up for dispute. And now I think it's up for dispute whether we have a right, for instance, to retirement security. And that is a battle that I think has to be fought. I'm very proud when our our campaign got underway last summer, we took out a full-page ad when Social Security and Medicare was being debated in Washington, and it said, the headline said, "Cutting Social Security and Medicare is not fiscal responsibility, it's betrayal." And our point was that it can be rationalized, and there are a lot of professors and others who will be brought in, and they're often paid quite handsomely to splice and dice the numbers and to say, oh, there's a fiscal problem here, and so retirement must be ratcheted down in terms of levels of security, and that's just the real world, and people have to get used to it. And lost in that whole shuffle is the reality that Social Security has never contributed a dime to the deficit. But somehow Social Security was thrown into the mix and into the debate, often by the forces that historically for decades have hated the idea of Social Security, hated the fact that it is in reality solvent. All the studies, including from the trust fund, say that for another quarter of a century, Social Security is totally solvent. And after that, if we simply have raised, and we can raise the cap from 106,000 or whatever it is right now, so that Bill Gates will pay a bit more than you or I total for our Social Security, that sort of thing, that it's solvent indefinitely. Basically, this is a genius system of Social Security, but we've been getting this messaging often from media and from a lot of politicians that encourage many young people to believe, and they will say this quite often, Social Security will not be there for me. Yeah. Well, that's really not true unless we ratchet down our own, not only expectations, but the political protective structures that have been erected around Social Security to the point that the fear becomes reality. If we protect Social Security, it will be here, and it will be here in full force. As a matter of fact, rather than decrease Social Security payments, there are a lot of economists that make a strong case that cost of living allowance, for instance, could become more liberal and provide better increases rather than fewer. And of course, there's a downward pressure propaganda to try to reduce how COLAs or the cost of living allowances are even allocated. So I think that's there. I did want to say something about Medicare because, of course, that's another big part of retirement security. It's true that Medicare, unlike Social Security, Medicare does have a financial problem in the fairly near to middle range term. But it's not because of Medicare. I mean, people have talked, I think, mistakenly about how government is inefficient and Medicare is inefficient. And here we're talking about in medical terms, you have insurance corporations that are at the center of healthcare, and their administrative costs are often 26, 28, 30%. And you look at Medicare administrative costs, it's as you say, it's way under 5%. And so what are we talking about here? And yet the Medicare cost curve is not being bent, and it continues to go up. It's being bent upward, you might say. But that's not the fault of Medicare. It's not the fault of that 3 or 4% administrative cost. It's actually a very efficient system. It's about the corporate medical system that unfortunately Medicare is so enmeshed with, Medicare Part D and the pharmaceutical industry being a case in point, but the hospital industry, conglomerates more and more, the insurance industry, and that is a tremendous upward pressure. Many of those largest corporations that are dominant in those areas have been posting record profits. So the health, what's been called the health industrial complex, is making out like a bandit with massive profits. And Medicare is being trashed when it's an efficient system that also holds the promise for providing people's human rights. And I think the example of Canada is a good one because Canada did it province by province. Mm-hmm. One province after another. Let's see what single-payer, guaranteed health care for all can do. And people loved it. And so it went from one province to another, and now it's a national system. And unfortunately, there's a big roadblock in Washington on Capitol Hill against single-payer health care. I mentioned Donna Smith she's now with the California Nurses Association, who was in SICO, and Donna and I and John Conyers have been the three co-chairs of the Healthcare Not Warfare campaign, and as the title of our group implies, the warfare has to end, not warfare, not perpetual war, one war after another. And so that's a huge part of what we've been working on. The other is the healthcare part. John Conyers' bill, H.R. 676, would provide enhanced Medicare, guaranteed single-payer health care for everybody in the United States. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten through the Congress. So, in a sense, Plan B that I want to work on as a representative of the North Coast District in Washington is, as we pursue the goal of guaranteed single-payer health care, enhanced Medicare for everybody, we also want to make it easier for individual states to enact guaranteed health care. And that can be done. There's a big push for that in Vermont. There's a big push for that here in California. Yeah, we've only recently missed it in terms of on the floor of the legislature here. It can be done, but like anything worthwhile, especially large scale, we're going to have to fight for it. And in the Congress, what I want to do, and I've talked with people at John Conyers' office about this, is legislation that will make it easier for the state of California to enact our guaranteed single-payer health care for everybody inside our own state. And it's such a huge state, it's very practical to do it. You would have a risk pool, as you point out, that's the young, the old, everybody in between. It would pencil out very nicely. We know it can work. The question is whether the federal government will not or will be a roadblock to enacting that here. So I think it's really about, as a practical matter in this district, we know a Democrat is going to be elected to represent our district. The question is what kind of Democrat. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of corporate Democrats around and folks who will simply respond to Wall Street. I think it's symbolized by the way in which Dick Durbin, the senator from Illinois, said a couple of years ago, referring to the U.S. Congress, he said, "The banks run this place." Well, what kind of legislative body is run by big banks? I mean, that's crazy, But it is an astute remark about a reality, as you say, of what we're dealing with in Congress. And that's why I'm proud to say I'm a liberal populist, I'm a progressive populist. I think you've got to fight the big banks. You've got to be willing to stand up for people who are losing their homes, who are losing their small businesses, whose kids sometimes don't know if they're going to have a school bus to take them to school. I mean, these are upside-down priorities. And it's a question of organizing effectively. And quite often, people understandably, they're so angry at Congress, they're so angry at Washington, they say, I don't want to have anything to do with them. But I think that sort of cutting off nose to spite face, we have to engage in this process. We have to be willing to change things, even if we've got to do some work that we might feel we would prefer to, I'd rather go hiking or something. From Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, Sonoma County, Marin County, and I don't want to leave out Trinity County either. 6 counties, and people say, well, we're all really different. Well, I can tell you, there's a lot of poverty in Marin County, believe it or not, all the hype aside. There are places, there are rural areas, there are people who don't see dentists, for many years at a time because they can't afford it. There are people all over this district, and more of this is a problem in the northern counties of this district, where you go to the emergency room, there are people who shouldn't have to be there. They're in the emergency room because there's not primary health care. And it's a tragedy. You see kids waiting hour after hour for conditions that have gotten worse and worse over a period of weeks because the parents don't feel they have the money. And that's one of the things that has to change in terms of, while we're fighting for the big solution of guaranteed health care for everybody, we now have this example of Congressman Bernie Sanders. Now Senator Bernie Sanders, I have never taken and will not take a dime of corporate PAC money. I don't want corporate money. We've raised $350,000 in this campaign from more than 3,000 different individuals. And so to me, given how rotten the campaign finance system is, that's the healthiest way to do it. And I take a lot of inspiration from Bernie Sanders. He's won statewide in Vermont a number of times. He's somebody who has not taken corporate PAC money. He's willing to be independent. Like me, he raises a lot of money from a lot of different people rather than a whole lot of money from just a few people or corporate PACs. And I think in the healthcare area, he's a great example. You know, when I went to the Open Door Clinic here and I got a tour and I read about the clinic and I learned about really the fantastic things they're doing for people of all ages, I went back to look at some of the legislation in Washington, and I realized that Senator Bernie Sanders had a lot to do with the funding security for the Open Door Clinic, because he fought like hell to include in the health reform bill major funding for what are called federally qualified health centers, or FQHCs. And to me, that's a role model, because what he said is, well, if you want my vote, you have to guarantee huge amounts of funding for these specific health clinics that serve underserved populations, that are often helping people in rural areas, provide nurse practitioners, provide dental care, provide physicians, where otherwise, if we don't have these centers, a lot of people just aren't going to have health care, or they will have the right to drive for 2 or 3 hours to get to a healthcare provider. And so what Bernie Sanders did, and what I want to continue to fight for, to join with him and others in Washington, is to say, look, we have to make sure that the federal government provides the funding for health care around the country. It's not okay to say, California, Humboldt County, you're on your own. It is required morally, ethically, as a democratic society, for the Congress to appropriate funds so that the Open Door Clinic here gets adequate resources. And you know, when you go to that clinic and you're in the waiting room and you see people of all ages and all backgrounds, you realize this is something beautiful. It didn't come from the sky. People had to fight for it. And I think that's politics at its best. And that's where I think continuity of funding is really important, because I looked at the blueprints, this was a few months ago, and this is going to be just a fabulous health complex, really. We've got to make sure that 1, 2, 3, 5 years from now, the federal funding as a federally qualified health center has to be adequate. You know, you can't plan something for 1 year or 2 years if you don't know that you're going to have adequate funding for many years. So I think, again, that's a federal imperative. Let's make government something we can be proud of instead of something that is leaving us high and dry. I think it's possible, as Bernie Sanders has shown, to fight the power, to fight the big money, and to represent the grassroots interests. There's sort of a myth that we hear in the mass media that it's not possible to go against the corporate grain, you know, that everybody has to sort of be on the take, so to speak, from corporate PAC dollars and so forth. And often politicians go up the ladder, and that's the case, you know, in this race. I'm dealing with, you know, one candidate in particular in the Assembly who's taken tens and tens of thousands of dollars allowed by state law directly from corporations, AT&T, Gallo, Chevron, PG&E. You know, you total it up, it's $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 from these corporations, and they are not philanthropies, last time I checked. You know, they give money because they know that it has an effect. And call me old-fashioned, but I believe if you're standing on the floor of the legislature in Sacramento or the United States Congress and you're voting on legislation that stands to make or lose millions or billions of dollars for a corporation that just gave you a ton of money, there's something wrong with that. Now, we can't stop that unless we build grassroots campaigns that have strength. I mean, I say we've got to have our feet on the ground and our eyes on the stars. If you just have your eyes on the stars, you can't get anything done. And if you just have your feet on the ground, what you're going to get done doesn't have a moral basis quite often, because it's just go along to get along. So I think we have an opportunity to build a different kind of politics. That's why part of the saying of the Solomon for Congress campaign, you can see on our site, is a new kind of politics from the grassroots. And I think grassroots have always had that capacity, sometimes realized, to manifest power that people have. And often we have a sort of ambivalent approach to the word power because it's been so misused. Power often in the customary context is something that we don't like because it's used by the concentrations of economic and political power which are not very democratic, which are often counter-democratic. So, well, if that's power, we don't want anything to do with it. And that's an understandable reaction, but I think it's wrong. It's like when I go to campuses sometimes and people will say, I'm really not into politics. And my response is, well, that's your prerogative. But in any event, politics is into you. All you got to do is turn on the kitchen tap and drink some water. Literally, politics is into you, because whether there's pollution or what kind of toxins are or not in that water is a result of politics, this political contest, political struggle, political push-pull, and then we get the results. I think power can have a positive reality as well, which is people power, grassroots power. Everything we can be proud of in our country is a result of that manifestation. I mean, think about just in the lifetimes of many people who are still with us today. Social Security, unemployment compensation, the right to organize, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, environmental protection. We have so many different laws on the books today, sometimes imperfectly enforced, sometimes inadequate, but still improvements as a result of the fact that people organized. And often people say, well, I just want to do election work, or I just want to do non-election work. I respect those choices as individuals, but as communities, I think we have to do both. I think we need to recognize that it's important to protest, that the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's rights movements, and many others were able to bring issues to the fore and build momentum on those issues because people organized and they protested. Sometimes they engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience very constructively. And at the same time, I think we need to have grassroots power manifested in elections as well, because it matters who's in the assembly, it matters who's a supervisor in the Congress. We find out, sometimes to our great unhappiness, that it really matters who's in power. So ultimately, some people may feel this is sort of hokey. I think it's about democracy. Democracy is really our future. That's where our hope is. And we've got to make it live. Democracy isn't this thing you go down to the Kmart, you pick it up, put it off the shelf. Okay, I think I'll buy the democracy today. It's not something we just sort of consume. It's something we have to create. We're active participants. And I'm really proud that that's what our campaign is about. I would join the Progressive Caucus of the U.S. Congress in a nanosecond. I would not join the Blue Dog Coalition. Those are very different approaches to economic and social justice. My passion is with those who are up against the wall when it comes to Wall Street. You might say up against the Wall Street. People who are suffering from lack of health care, education, housing. I'll give you a specific example. I mentioned John Conyers, who I've worked with. He has a bill in Congress. It's called the 21st Century Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Training Act. And that advocates two very strong positions, not just rhetorically, but in the legislation for implementation. One is committing the U.S. government to full employment. When the private sector, when Wall Street is not doing the job, it's not getting the job done, not providing employment, when in fact it has dropped this country into a ditch, then it is the government's responsibility to do public investment, provide massive federal jobs programs to the tune of the New Deal, the CCC, the WPA. That is a reality that this bill can get the federal government to do enough public investment so we can create massive quantities of jobs. It would be felt here in Humboldt County and around the country. The second part of it is a 1/4% transaction tax on Wall Street that would provide a minimum of $150 billion with a B dollars a year, and that money can be used according to the legislation for job training and federal jobs programs. Well, I support that. No, I don't only support it, I'm raring to go to Congress to fight for it. And that's a difference between me and the present member of Congress. Well, the fact is, this is a fresh start because this is an open seat. 100% of the people who get their ballots in this congressional race will not see an incumbent. So we're going to see a new member of Congress from this district. The question is, what kind of member of Congress? We know that person's going to be a Democrat because the registration advantage of Democrats is just so huge. The question is, what kind of Democrat? And I'm the kind of Democrat who's going to fight to tax Wall Street and use that money to create jobs. So I think that's a big difference. Medicare needs improvement. It's too corporatized, notoriously Part D in terms of enriching pharmaceutical corporations at the expense, sometimes quite literally, of people on Medicare. So it's not to deify or just say that Medicare is perfect. It's an imperfect but working model that we can improve, and we should widen, I think, for the whole population. When I went to Iraq in 2002, I talked to some physicians about the use of depleted uranium, and as you point out, the use of DU during the first Gulf War and in other conflicts has been very widespread by the Pentagon, and it's really indefensible, you know. And I think that there's a real reason for concern. There's talk about you know, Gulf War syndrome. I do have background working with atomic veterans, that is, some of the 250,000 U.S. soldiers who were exposed to nuclear weapons tests at close range while in the military from 1945 to 1962. These are atmospheric nuclear tests. The VA has been notorious in denying claims, not based on epidemiology or biostatistics, but these are political decisions that are made. And as the saying goes, don't get me started, because I could go all night about the way in which ionizing radiation standards have been set by the Pentagon, and even the medical industry has been slow to acknowledge. For instance, now you would never do in utero exposure of ionizing radiation, whereas in the 1950s, that was being done as a commonplace. And then let's stop and think. A pregnant woman living near Fukushima, that's in utero exposure. Nuclear weapons testing was global in utero exposure. We had Linus Pauling, the great Nobel winner, who led a crusade to end atmospheric nuclear tests. Well, the idea of a threshold of lethal or benign ionizing radiation levels, that's been proven false. There is no safe level of radiation, and so it's a sort of a dose-response curve rather than saying, okay, it's a safe level. That's a huge problem with a lot of ways that the entire nuclear fuel cycle has been used. It's one of the many reasons that I've called for closure of both of California's nuclear power plants. I think that we've got to promote solar and wind and other responsible green technologies.
I'm glad you brought up Fukushima, because we literally had our Humboldt County Department of Public Health putting out press releases saying there is no danger of fallout from Fukushima, and then we have it being detected. We have nuclear waste now washing up on shore, killing seals in Alaska. I mean, what level of denial are we going to put up with?
Well, what's unfortunate is that there's a strong tendency to rely on federal agencies to determine the safety of nuclear radiation exposure, when those agencies have often been involved in promoting nuclear power. And that's a historic reality. The Atomic Energy Commission used to be both a propagator and regulator, and then they were broken off into different parts and so forth. But this has come up in this congressional race. After Fukushima, our campaign took out a full-page ad. It said, isn't it time to close California's nuclear power plants? We have it on our site at solomonforcongress.com. And our ad quoted from the same newspaper article where my opponent, Jared Huffman, said, well, if studies from the federal government show that Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant is dangerous, then I would support closing it. In contrast to that, my position is, why would we wait for federal agencies that have been promoting nuclear power for decades to tell us that a nuclear power plant is unsafe, much less when the nuclear power plant in question in Central California is built on major earthquake faults next to the ocean. So it becomes a question, are we going to really be honest about the history of the relationship between the nuclear power industry and the federal government? People speculate about, could Fukushima happen here? Well, of course it could. Absolutely could. For one thing, Japan is a highly technological society. Arguably, there is no more technologically sophisticated and knowledgeable country in the world. So with all of that, Fukushima, the disaster, occurred there and really continues to occur. But even if we were to set aside, and I don't think we should, the possibility of nuclear power plant meltdowns, there is a certainty, I was going to say lead pipe certainty, but I don't know the proper expression. There's a certainty of vast quantities of high-level nuclear waste, including plutonium, cesium, strontium, remaining with many of the isotopes for many, many, many centuries, into the hundreds of thousands of years. That's a guarantee. Yeah. Is that what we're going to leave for the next generations? So I think, again, it comes down to some of the political issues involved, where, let's face it, PG&E is a powerful corporation. The fact that they gave $11,000 to my opponent, Jared Huffman, while he's in the Assembly, well, he'll have to answer to that. But the fact is that PG&E owns Diablo Canyon. PG&E and many other nuclear-invested corporations in this state and this country have very close relationships with state and federal officials. And this is the history of the nuclear age. I'm sorry to say, I co-authored a book with Harvey Wasserman. It came out in 1982, Killing Our Own. The subtitle was The Disaster of America's Experience with Atomic Radiation. Well, that was what, 30 years ago? And I'm sorry to say there's a lot more disaster since then, not always visited on us from projects within our own shores. When you look at, say, what happened with Chernobyl, which occurred 4 years after our book came out. So I think that what we want, whether it's with the question of ionizing radiation or pesticides or toxics of various descriptions, a wide range of chemicals, GMOs, we want government officials and agencies who are honest brokers. We don't want them to be beholden to Fortune 500 companies with billions of dollars as investments. And that's sort of a political precautionary principle that we should be implementing. This is a very deep green district in that sense. And I think that if we're going to stand up for a future that's sustainable, then we need political representation that's willing to put up the fight. There is a tremendous power of grassroots organizing. And the fact is, many of the 80 members of the Progressive Caucus in the U.S. Congress are there because they beat the corporate odds. They went up against the big money candidates. They were willing and able to organize from the grassroots. And for us, the fact we have 750 volunteers. We're now based in Humboldt County. We have an office as part of or inside of the Humboldt County Democratic Party headquarters in Eureka. We've got so many volunteers up and down this district, and that's how, as I say, you beat AstroTurf with grassroots. And we're doing the grassroots organizing. So there's never a guarantee, but I think this is how it's being done, and it can be done in this election. You can't beat something with nothing. That corporate power is usually dominant in elections, but if we have strong grassroots capacities and we organize effectively, we can do amazing things. And it's been done time after time. One of my heroes is Paul Wellstone, and I remind people that he never held elective office before he became a U.S. Senator, and he was outspent 4-1 when he was elected to the U.S. Senate. He did it by grassroots organizing, and I think there's no per se magic to it, but it does have amazing capacities, because when you think about it, people get stuff in the mail, they turn on the TV, they listen to the radio, but when a neighbor, a friend, or just a human being, which is really important, makes a personal connection, comes to the front door, talks to them at the farmer's market, gives them some literature, engages in dialogue. Every study I've seen on election responses says that those personal encounters have a lot more impact on the vote than just something that comes in the mail, as we get closer and closer to the election. So I'm realistic, as I say, feet on the ground, eyes on the stars. We can do it. It's about organizing and being true to our values and our principles. I think maybe I'll close on this note. We had a rally in Sonoma County a few months ago with 2 other speakers besides myself. We had several hundred people who turned out. One was Casimiro Alvarez from the United Farm Workers, and he was organizing and we were helping to challenge the veto by Governor Brown of the Farm Worker Rights Bill, essentially, that would remove obstacles to workers in the fields to form unions. And So we invited Mr. Alvarez to speak, and he talked about the ongoing struggle for human rights of farm workers. And the other speaker was Sean Penn, who campaigned with me and is a big supporter of our campaign. And I went to Iraq with him, I went to Iran with him, and since then, of course, he's done great work in Haiti. And he talked about what went on in Egypt. And he said, who would have thought that people could go to Tahrir Square, they could organize, and they could overthrow the tyranny of Mubarak. He said, how they did it was principle as strategy. And he said, I think that's what the Solomon for Congress campaign is. That's what we're doing. We're focusing on principle as strategy. It doesn't mean that we're just hoping. On the contrary, it means we have principle that we mobilize behind through our hard work, if you will, through the nuts and bolts. And the nuts and bolts that are fastened onto our commitment and our ideals, that's what can get the job done. That's why I'm optimistic that I can represent this district in Congress. So with that, I mean, maybe maybe that's a way to close here, but I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks, and I look forward to working with you.
Enjoy your guys' circle jerk.
So were you told you couldn't let your children play?
Yeah, gave me a ticket to boot. I don't know what.